Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to a time when science went rogue in a foggy city by the sea. Picture this. It's early morning in 1950s San Francisco. The streets glisten with dew. The streetcars hum their lazy rhythms, and the ocean mist creeps through the alleyways like some ghostly theater smoke cue. You're walking along the Embarcadero, jacket collar flipped against the chill, thinking only of your next cup of coffee. But the air you're breathing? It's not just salty Pacific breeze. There's something else in it tonight. Something you definitely didn't sign up for. You inhale deeply. Maybe you even stretch and laugh a little. After all, this is the golden age of optimism, isn't it? The war is over, jazz is hot, and America is flexing its scientific muscles. But you don't know what you've just inhaled. Nobody does. And by the time they figure it out, well, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I love reading your comments, so let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step out onto Market Street, still half asleep. As the city begins to stir, it's just another foggy day. But this fog? It's carrying a secret. One that's been cooked up in government laboratories, debated in smoky briefing rooms, and signed off with a shrug by men in pressed uniforms. You don't see them. Of course, they're far offshore, watching, waiting, taking notes. Welcome to Operation Sea Spray, the strangest experiment you never heard of. It's not science fiction, though it should be. It's not a conspiracy theory. This really happened. And it all began quietly, with no public announcement, no consent, and definitely no hazmat suits. Back then, San Francisco was seen as an ideal test subject, a cooperative environment, they called it, meaning a place where people went about their lives, blissfully unaware. Scientists love a controlled variable, and the morning fog rolling in off the Pacific created the perfect cover for a little microbial mischief. That's what they called it behind closed doors. Microbial aerosol release. Sounds like a fancy air freshener, doesn't it? You walk by the ferry building. People are coughing more than usual. A child sneezes on her way to school. Maybe you notice it, maybe you don't. Nobody connects the dots. Why would they? It's just another day in paradise. But here's the kicker. That fog you walked through, it was laced with Serratia marcescens, a bacteria with a dramatic flare. It turns bright red when it grows. Imagine waking up to find blood-red stains in your bathroom sink or on your bread. Some people did, and still, nobody questioned it. Historians still argue whether the military ever truly believed the bacteria were harmless. On paper, Serratia was chosen for its low pathogenicity. Basically, it was supposed to be safe, but safe for whom? In reality, it can cause infections, especially in people with weakened immune systems. Hospitals know this. In fact, it's considered an opportunistic pathogen even today, often found causing urinary tract infections, pneumonia, and, ironically, hospital-acquired illnesses. And just to set the scene, this wasn't a one-time prank. For 6 days in September 1950, ships like the USS Breckenridge stationed offshore released a bacteria cloud across the city. It drifted in like weather, crept under doorways, clung to laundry lines. You probably would have joked about the fog tasting funny. Meanwhile, a few scientists in lab coats stood on rooftops and corners, quietly collecting air samples. Hidden sampling devices recorded how far the bacteria spread. Spoiler alert, it went everywhere. If this were a movie, you'd expect someone to shout, "This is madness!" But nobody did. It was all methodically logged. Spreadsheet science with a human cost. What's strange, and honestly a little chilling, is that nobody in San Francisco had the faintest idea. There was no warning, no after-action report. Nothing was disclosed until decades later. And by then, any outrage was drowned out by the ticking of a much newer, louder Cold War clock. Let's pause and take in the irony for a moment. A nation obsessed with defending its citizens was quietly exposing them to bacteria for the sake of national defense. And not in the desert or on a military base, but in coffee shops, schools, and downtown lunch spots. There's an old saying in science: if you want to study something, don't interfere with it. Let it behave naturally, and the military took that to heart. What better way to see how a city reacts to biowarfare than to treat it like a live Petri dish? Of course, no one used the term biowarfare back then, not in public. The buzzwords were aerosol dissemination, urban vulnerability, and simulant studies. All very clinical, all very polite. One fringe historian, who may or may not own too many gas masks, has even argued that the true aim wasn't just research, it was psychological readiness. To normalize the idea that these kinds of tests were part of the background hum of modern life. Trust the science, they'd say. Even when it's fogged in red bacteria. Back in your dreamlike stroll along the pier, none of this crosses your mind. You're thinking about a breakfast sandwich, maybe, or the sound of a seagull that won't shut up. You have no idea that the government just used your lungs as data points. And honestly, that's the scariest part of all. You didn't feel anything. Not then. Not until maybe later, when the city starts to cough. You wake up the next morning, maybe a little groggy. There's a strange red smear in your bathroom sink. You blink at it, rub your eyes, run the tap, and watch it swirl away. Weird. You think it might be rust in the pipes, or maybe your roommate spilled tomato juice. You don't dwell on it, but across the city, dozens of others are finding the same thing. Red streaks on windowsills, reddish blotches on their toast. A few folks even notice their wounds healing slower or reopening with an odd tinge. It's unsettling. But in that classic post-war way, nobody panics. Everyone's too polite or too tired to raise an alarm. And why would they? This is San Francisco in 1950, a city that lives in the mist. You expect strange things to drift in off the ocean. What you don't expect is that those reddish streaks are signs of something alive, growing, spreading, breathing with you. Out in Pacific Heights, a man named Edward Nevin wakes up feeling off. He's 75, recovering from prostate surgery, and he's starting to hallucinate. His temperature spikes. His urine turns cloudy. Within days, his body fails him. In a quiet hospital room filled with the hiss of oxygen and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes, Edward Nevin dies. Doctors scratch their heads. They run cultures. And what do they find? Serratia marquescens. Red, rare, and totally unexpected in that hospital setting. In fact, no hospital in the U.S. had ever recorded a Serratia infection before. That's right, ever. Not one case. And now suddenly, several pop up at once, in the same facility. Statistically, it makes about as much sense as finding a palm tree in Antarctica. Historians still argue whether the military's experiment directly caused Nevin's death. Some say it's coincidence. Others point out that his infection was systemic and matched the bacteria used in Operation Sea Spray, right down to the strain. Officially, there's no confession, just a lingering silence, like a foghorn echoing into nothing. His family, to their credit, didn't just let it go. They pressed for answers years later when the truth began to trickle out through declassified documents. But there were no charges, no apologies, no payout. Just vague government statements about the needs of national defense and the presumed safety of the bacteria used. Meanwhile, back in 1950, people are getting sick and nobody's saying why. Respiratory infections begin to climb, quietly, like a tide. A small spike in cases of pneumonia here, a strange infection there. Nothing explosive, nothing headline-grabbing, just a murmur of illness across a city that never gave its consent. And the red? Oh yes, it lingers. The bacteria thrives in damp places, bathrooms, bread boxes, lungs. People whisper about it at diners. Someone jokes that the city's bleeding. Another says it's a sign of the apocalypse. But mostly, everyone just wipes it away and goes about their day. That's how this kind of science works. It hides in plain sight. The newspapers don't report on the mysterious stains or sudden illnesses. Why would they? There's no press release, no known scandal, just a little extra fog and a few sniffles. It's the Cold War era, after all. People are too busy worrying about the bomb to notice the bacteria. This was the genius and the horror of Operation Sea Spray. It wasn't about what people knew, it was about what they didn't know. The military wanted to see how a real biological attack might go unnoticed. Turns out, pretty easily. Think about that. A city of 800,000 people, and not one raised a formal alarm. No mass panic, no riots, no barricades or demands for transparency, just morning commuters, late-night jazz clubs, and the slow churn of life under a microbial cloud. And let's talk about the bacteria itself again, because it's not just a red pigment machine. Serratia martescens is a crafty little organism. It loves moisture, it resists antibiotics, and in the wrong host, it can turn deadly. Hospitals today still deal with it in ICUs, especially when it contaminates catheters or ventilators. It's sneaky, opportunistic, and surprisingly persistent. One fun fact? Back in the 1800s, before anyone knew better, Serratia was considered magical. Monks in Europe called it the miracle microbe because it would appear as blood-red spots on communion wafers, often interpreted as divine signs. Turns out, it was just contaminated bread. So much for divine intervention. But in San Francisco, there's nothing miraculous about it. You keep seeing those red smears for a few more weeks. Then they start to fade. The fog returns to normal. The air feels cleaner. People forget. That's how stories like this disappear. Not with a bang, but with a shrug. And deep in some windowless room in a Navy office, the data begins to pile up. Charts showing bacterial spread patterns. Reports noting how far the germs traveled, up to 50 miles inland. Scientists clink coffee mugs and nod approvingly. A successful test, someone says. You, however, never got the memo. You're still wondering if your kitchen sponge is just moldy or if something weirder's going on. You throw it away, problem solved. Meanwhile, a few curious doctors in the city begin to take note. The spike in infections is odd. The presence of this unusual bacteria in non-hospital environments? Very odd. But without a clear link or admission, all they have are questions. And in Cold War America, questions don't get answered. They get filed away. It's a strange dance between science and secrecy, between ethics and efficiency, between the fog that you can see and the truth hidden in it. You walk past another coughing stranger on a munibus. You crack a window. You feel better. You're breathing easier now. But what's in the air next time? That question lingers long after the red stains are gone. It's a few weeks later, and you're still walking the same streets. Chinatown glowing in lantern light, the Mission District rattling with Spanish chatter and jukeboxes, the Golden Gate still doing its best impression of a bridge to nowhere in the morning fog. Life, as they say, goes on. But across the bay, in a nondescript Navy building with green shaded lamps and a whole lot of paperwork, something strange is unfolding. A man in uniform, call him Lieutenant Commander Richard S. Wheeler, because that's his name, is standing in front of a whiteboard, drawing concentric circles across a map of San Francisco. Each ring represents bacterial spread, time intervals, projected exposures. Around the room, other men in starch-heavy uniforms nod along. There are no civilians present, no reporters, just an idea whose time, apparently, has come. The idea? That the United States should study how cities react to biological attacks, not after, but during, and not with theory, or simulations, or sterile petri dishes. With the real thing. This is the moment where strange science crosses a moral line. You're watching it happen from the outside, but back in that room, there's no dramatic villain speech, just bullet points, efficiency, terms like urban vulnerability analysis. It sounds boring until you realize it's a plan to unleash bacteria into crowded cities to see what happens. And the guy with the whiteboard? He's not mad. He's ambitious. He's got a security clearance and a budget. He sees this not as an atrocity, but a public service. His reasoning is classic Cold War. If a real enemy were to attack the U.S. with biological weapons, the government needed to know how to respond. How far would germs spread? How many people would get sick? Would the public notice? Would panic ensue? They needed data, and data required exposure. Real exposure. Historians still argue whether anyone in those rooms truly believed the bacteria being used were harmless. Some claim the scientists involved were operating in good faith, relying on the limited information of the time. Others point to internal memos that suggest they knew more than they let on, that the risk wasn't zero, that test subjects could suffer. But that debate comes later. Right now, in this scene, all you hear is chalk on the board, the low buzz of fluorescent lights, and the scratch of pens against government forms. Operation Sea Spray is already underway, and it's about to expand. The man leading the charge behind the idea is no stereotypical evil genius. He's smart, well-dressed, patriotic. He's probably got a family, maybe a dog. He believes in what he's doing. That's the unsettling part. Because what he's proposing isn't science fiction, it's logistics. Ships positioned off the coast, measured releases of biological agents into air currents, coordinated sampling from rooftops and bus stops, analysis of public health records. It's a project rooted in methodical, peer-reviewed precision. He even has the perfect organism picked out. Serratia marcescens. Bright red, easily traceable, and, on paper anyway, non-lethal. It grows fast, it survives long, and it doesn't cause disease. Unless it does. Fringe scientists at the time were already whispering about its potential danger, especially in hospital settings or for immunocompromised patients. But the Navy's own documentation called it safe for humans. Problem solved. Except, of course, it wasn't. Let's pause here for a quirky footnote. You know the foghorns that moan across the bay at night? Those weren't just for atmosphere. They were actually studied during Operation Sea Spray. Researchers speculated whether sound vibrations could help distribute bacteria more evenly through air pockets. Imagine that. The military trying to weaponize sound to spread germs. Science fiction meets jazz club ambiance. But back to our Navy man. He needed a place to test his theory. A place big enough to matter, isolated enough to monitor, and unwitting enough not to interfere. Enter San Francisco. Why San Francisco? Well, it ticked all the boxes. Coastal winds made for predictable spread patterns. The fog trapped particles close to the ground. The city's compact layout made data collection easier. And most importantly, its population was large, diverse, and utterly unaware. In fact, it was so ideal that internal memos referred to it as a lab rat city. Not exactly a compliment. And so, in September of 1950, the plan kicked off. The Navy outfitted the USS Breckenridge and a few smaller vessels with spray canisters loaded with Serratia and Bacillus globigii, another microbe chosen for its visibility and presumed safety. At pre-dawn hours, under cover of fog, they sprayed it in long arcs across the waterline. The mist caught the wind, swirled through the bay, and drifted over the city. You didn't notice. Of course you didn't. It was just another foggy morning, but the Navy noticed. Their rooftop sensors lit up. Air samples were pulled from buildings, bus stops, and street corners. The bacteria had traveled dozens of miles, as far inland as Berkeley and down the peninsula to Daly City. According to their calculations, over 800,000 people inhaled the bacteria over the 6-day test period. That's nearly every man, woman, and child in San Francisco at the time. You, reader, dreamer, late-night history sleuth, might ask, how did they get away with it? The answer is chillingly simple. No one was told. Not the mayor, not city council, not hospitals. The entire experiment was conducted without public knowledge, let alone consent. And in 1950, that wasn't illegal. Technically, after all, they weren't hurting anyone, just gathering data for science, for national security, for the greater good. Still, it's hard not to picture the faces of those sailors standing on deck, watching the mist drift toward shore. Did they hesitate? Did any of them ask, "Is this right?" Or were they just following orders, convinced they were part of something necessary? It's easy to judge from a distance, harder to grasp when you're in the middle of it, when you're told the Cold War justifies everything, even testing microbes on your own citizens. The ships pull away, the fog clears, the bacteria, invisible and silent, remains. And on dry land, the man with the whiteboard begins sketching out ideas for the next test. You're back in the city, sipping weak diner coffee as the fog clings to the window outside like a damp curtain. Across the street, a mail truck sputters past, trailing exhaust. Another ordinary morning, except it isn't, because out in the gray waters just beyond the Bay Bridge, a Navy vessel floats silently. Not a warship, not exactly, more like a ghost ship for scientists. It's before dawn. You don't see it, but there's movement on board. Technicians in white coats checking valves, sailors adjusting spray nozzles. From large tanks below deck, a fine mist begins to hiss skyward. You'd think it was steam if you could see it, but you can't. That's the point. It blends with the fog, folds into the breeze, and drifts gently toward shore. This is Operation Sea Spray in full swing, the largest open-air biological experiment ever conducted on Utte's soil, at least that we know of. There's no drama to it, no flashing lights or alarms, just science in its most unsettling form. Invisible, methodical, and confident. For 6 straight days, the Navy repeats the process, morning after morning. They release trillions of bacteria cells over San Francisco and monitor the spread like meteorologists tracking a storm. And the results? Disturbingly efficient. Air samples from more than 43 different locations across the city show widespread bacterial exposure. Rooftops, bus terminals, post offices, even hospitals show contamination. The bacteria moves through ventilation systems, clings to clothing, and settles in the crevices of downtown buildings. By their own estimates, every single person in San Francisco inhaled at least 5,000 test particles. You probably breathe deeper just hearing that. Sorry about that. Some of the devices used to collect data were hidden in plain sight, disguised as weather balloons, telephone equipment, or even cigarette machines. Scientists stationed in cars and coffee shops watched the fog drift and made notes in quiet detachment. There's something almost poetic about it. If you ignore the whole using citizens as test subjects without consent part. The mist rolls in, the city wakes up, and the scientists scribble down exposure levels over scrambled eggs. Historians still debate the exact intent of sea spray. Was it a legitimate defense exercise or a wild experiment in population control? Some argue that it was simply a data-gathering mission meant to study the logistics of biological dispersion in a major city. Others suspect the military saw the public not as citizens to protect, but variables to test. Either way, the experiment worked. Let's talk a little about the bacteria again. Serratia marquescens, our little crimson friend, was used because it creates bright red colonies, making it easy to track. But this visual convenience came with a hidden danger. The bacteria can also cause pneumonia, urinary tract infections, and sepsis in immunocompromised individuals. You know, nothing too serious, unless you like breathing and staying alive. To make things more interesting, Bacillus globigii was also used in later tests. It's now classified as a surrogate for anthrax in military studies. At the time, it was believed to be harmless. Now, not so much. It's worth pausing here to appreciate the sheer audacity of the operation. The government sprayed bacteria into the air over a major city, repeatedly, and collected data on how far it traveled, who it reached, and how long it lingered. And then they didn't tell anyone. Not even a, "Hey, heads up, don't breathe too deeply this week." You stroll past a pharmacy on Mission Street. The line is a little longer than usual. People are coughing. Nothing alarming. Not yet. But in the hospitals, doctors begin to see unusual infections. Red-colored bacterial strains popping up in places they've never seen before. A man named Joseph Maza is hospitalized with a heart valve infection caused by, Serratia marquescens, one of 11 patients who develop similar conditions during or after the test period. Of course, no one connects these cases to a military operation. There's no reason to. The idea that your own government would secretly release bacteria into your neighborhood seems unthinkable, until it isn't. In official reports, Navy scientists wrote gleefully about the experiment's success. The bacteria had dispersed well over expectations. They were impressed by how easily it reached every corner of the city. There were recommendations for further tests, other cities, different bacteria, a note about experimenting with aerosolized simulants inside subways next time. Fun. This was science with a stopwatch, not a conscience. One fringe detail. A few military documents revealed that the scientists also tracked the bacteria by swabbing coin-operated machines around the city. Payphones, vending machines, laundry tokens. These were perfect collection points, as hundreds of people touched them daily. They called it indirect exposure measurement. You might call it gross. You stand at a payphone on Market Street, waiting to dial. You lift the receiver. You press the buttons. You breathe. Unknowingly, you contribute to the data set. And then it's over, just like that. 6 days of silent warfare, and the ships sail away. The bacteria, of course, remain. On shoes, in air ducts, in lungs. But the experiment is complete. The scientists go home. The paperwork begins. And you? You go on living your life. You have no idea what just happened. No one does. That's the real magic trick here. Not the bacteria, not the science, but the silence. The entire city was used as a laboratory, and no one noticed. Not a headline, not a whisper, not a protest. It would take over 2 decades before the truth came out. In 1976, a Senate subcommittee investigating biological warfare finally confirmed that Operation Sea Spray had occurred. They admitted the releases, they shared the data, they disclosed the bacteria, and then nothing. No apology, no accountability. Just a sterile confession printed in the congressional record and quickly buried under decades of secrecy. And the man in the lab coat with the maps? He moved on to other projects. Bigger cities, bigger ideas. You walk home under a sky that looks cleaner than it is. You're downtown again, years before the truth ever leaks out. You pass a newspaper stand. The San Francisco Chronicle headlines the usual. Politics, baseball, a mayoral scandal brewing in whispers. Nothing about bacteria, nothing about death. But a few columns down, buried in the local section, there's a small story about a man named Edward Nevin, who died under unusual medical circumstances. It doesn't say much. It couldn't, because even the doctors weren't sure what had happened. Edward Nevin was a retired pipe fitter, recovering from surgery at Stanford Hospital. Not a remarkable case, until he suddenly developed a massive systemic serratia infection that spread to his heart. It killed him within weeks. The doctors were baffled. This strain of serratia had never appeared in the hospital before. Not in any American hospital, in fact. And now it wasn't just in Nevin. It was in the sinks, on the walls, in the blood cultures of multiple patients, 11 of them, to be exact. The outbreak was so unusual, Stanford researchers documented it as a case study, the first time serratia marcescens had ever been recorded as a hospital-acquired infection in the U.S. You pause at a red light on Van Ness Avenue. A fire truck blares past. The siren cuts the air like a warning no one can decipher. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, nurses disinfect with a kind of frantic optimism. New cleaning protocols are written, but no one suspects the truth. The fog did this, or rather, the people who used the fog did. The Nevin family eventually starts asking questions. They want to know why a retired man with no history of infection suddenly died from a bacterium that practically glows under a microscope. But the answers are evasive. Coincidence, they're told. Rare, but not impossible. And the phrase that always kills a conversation: complications following surgery. Historians still argue whether Edward Nevin's death was directly caused by Operation Sea Spray, or if it was just an eerie overlap. The strain of serratia found in him matched the test strain. The timing was perfect. But proving causation without official acknowledgement, that's a battle fought with fog, not facts. And remember this: the government didn't admit anything for 26 years. By then, Edward Nevin was a footnote. His family's suspicions dismissed as grief-stained paranoia. That's the thing about secret science. It doesn't leave fingerprints. It leaves questions. You sit in a cafe near Union Square. A woman at the next table is coughing, but you hardly notice. After all, it's cold season. People get sick. And that's how the operation worked, by blending into everyday life. The coughs, the fevers, the slow deaths, all just part of the noise. Let's talk about the data again, because that's what the Navy wanted most. They had air samplers set up across the city, on rooftops, traffic lights, even tucked into public restrooms. They tested everything from humidity to wind speed to foot traffic. They tracked how bacteria clung to clothes, how it moved through buildings, how long it lived on skin. It was meticulous, almost artistic. The city was the canvas, the bacteria was the paint, and the test subjects, well, that was everyone. You included. And the experiment? In the eyes of the military, wildly successful. Their final report gushed with scientific glee. Serratia marcescens had spread exactly as predicted, possibly better. The test bacteria reached every neighborhood in the city within hours of the initial release. Some particles traveled as far as 50 miles inland, carried by wind and traffic. One stray wisp was even found in Sacramento. But there were hiccups, too. Though the Navy had predicted low health risks, the Nevin case and the hospital outbreak raised uncomfortable questions. Internally, there were memos asking whether public exposure levels should be re-evaluated. Someone even flagged the use of serratia as possibly not ideal for continued trials. You think? Still, instead of halting the project, they just shifted focus. New bacteria, new cities, more field exercises, as they liked to call them. Because nothing says peacetime research like sneaking bacteria into a city bus system. Here's a fringe tidbit. One classified suggestion proposed releasing bacteria during a large city parade to observe crowd behavior and health outcomes. The theory was that people's increased activity and shallow breathing while walking could provide better data on bacterial intake. Think about that the next time you're shoulder to shoulder in a crowd. There were no parades during sea spray, but plenty of busy sidewalks. And the data kept flowing in. More graphs, more reports, More evidence that America's own cities were the best bioweapons lab around. You glance up at the fog again. It's always there, like an old friend, or an old lie. Nobody questioned it. Who would? Fog is natural. San Francisco fog is practically trademarked. But during Operation Sea Spray, that fog was weaponized. And that makes you wonder, if they could do it then, what stops them now? The story of Sea Spray doesn't just live in history books or Senate hearings. It lives in every unassuming street corner, every forgotten cough, every quiet hospital bed where no one could figure out what went wrong. You cross the street, wind pushing against your coat. Somewhere behind you, a pair of government scientists once stood in a parked van, monitoring air quality through a disguised intake fan. They probably sipped coffee, laughed about their quotas. Then they wrote your breath into a file, and they called it data. You walk past the ferry building, where fog rolls in like a secret. The waterfront is quiet now, but it wasn't always. Back in the 1950s, the piers were busy with freight, tourists, and longshoremen. The Navy knew it. That's part of why they picked San Francisco. Not just because of the fog, but because it was alive. And the denser the crowd, the better the data. Operation Sea Spray wasn't an isolated experiment. It was just the beginning. A pilot test. A proof of concept for something far bigger. After the success in San Francisco, the U.S. military doubled down. If you were breathing in an American city between 1949 and 1969, you might have participated in a classified test without ever knowing. They called it Project 112, or sometimes Project SHAD, Shipboard Hazard and Defense. Both were umbrella programs that included hundreds of covert tests, not just in the U.S., but globally. Biological, chemical, even radiological. The Cold War wasn't just fought with missiles and spies, it was fought in the air you breathed. Let's pause for a moment and name a few of the cities where the U.S. government ran similar biological simulations. New York City, where light bulbs filled with bacillus spores were broken in subway stations to test how germs would spread through the tunnels. Washington, D.C., where bacteria were released from rooftops near the National Mall. St. Louis, where zinc-cadmium sulfide, a compound later linked to cancer, was sprayed over low-income housing neighborhoods. Minneapolis, Winnipeg, Key West, and even the Panama Canal Zone. No one was told. No one gave consent. The thinking was always the same. If we don't test it here, we'll never be ready when it happens for real. But what if it never happened? What if the enemy never came? And you were still treated like a battlefield? Back in San Francisco, the Navy quietly packed up after Operation Sea Spray. They left no plaques, no warnings, no apologies. The red fog disappeared as silently as it arrived. The city returned to normal, unaware that normal had been breached. Then came the lawsuits. In the 1970s, when the operation was finally revealed through Senate hearings and investigative journalism, the Nevin family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the U.S. government. They weren't the only ones. Several families came forward, claiming loved ones had suffered unexplained infections or illnesses after the 1950 experiment. The government's defense was chilling in its precision. The bacteria used were harmless. There is no direct evidence linking the tests to any deaths. National security justified secrecy. It worked. The court dismissed the case. Not because the facts were wrong, but because the government couldn't be held liable for actions deemed part of national defense. That phrase, national defense, became a catch-all cloak. A kind of legal fog, you might say, one that made invisible the very real consequences of these experiments. A congressional report later admitted that the scope and scale of these tests had not been fully disclosed to the public. That was their way of saying, we sprayed you without asking, and we probably should have mentioned it. You sip your coffee, and it tastes like nothing. But you wonder what's inside it, what's been tested on people through the years, not just bacteria, but ideas. Fear, compliance, silence. Because mind control doesn't always start with wires or hypnosis. Sometimes it starts with trust, with the belief that your government wouldn't hurt you, not without a good reason, not in your own city. And once that belief is gone, what's left? The term open-air biological testing is still used in defense documents. Sanitized, academic. But you know what it really means. Mass experimentation on civilians. Done without consent, done in secret, done with data as the end goal, and human health as an acceptable cost. A foghorn echoes across the bay. It sounds lonely. Or maybe that's just you. Standing in the knowledge that history was never clean. It was filled with leaks. Chemical, microbial, and moral. You wonder how many people are still alive from that 1950 fog. Not many. Fewer every year. But you're here, listening, thinking, breathing. And that's the strange power of stories like this. They don't fade away. They cling, like bacteria in the bloodstream, like secrets in the fog. You walk along the Embarcadero, your shoes echoing on the slick pavement. The sky overhead is overcast now, soft gray, like the memory of a secret. But the fog that once rolled in with microbes is gone. Just sky. Just silence. Still, your thoughts are crowded, because Operation Sea Spray wasn't just a bad idea. It became a blueprint. What if you could simulate panic, without the panic? What if you could test how far a gas or germ might spread, without ever alerting the people being tested? That was the dream, or perhaps the delusion. You picture the moment a military scientist sits before a map of Manhattan and thinks, what if we dropped something here, right at rush hour? How fast would it spread through the subways? How many people would carry it across bridges, tunnels, offices, taxis? They needed answers, and they got them. In New York, a test in 1966 involved light bulbs filled with Bacillus globigi, the same bacteria used in San Francisco. The bulbs were smashed near subway vents and turnstiles. It wasn't random. The chosen spots were areas with the highest foot traffic. At rush hour, the bacteria were traced from Lower Manhattan all the way up through the Bronx in a matter of hours. Millions were exposed. In Washington, D.C., bacteria were released from a van driving past government buildings, including the Pentagon and State Department. The idea was to test how well a biological agent could infiltrate the corridors of power. And it could, easily, but no one knew. Not the workers, not the tourists, not the janitors who locked up for the night, not the kids licking ice cream on the Capitol steps. If a real attack had happened, no one would have been ready. That was the justification. Always. But after years of experiments, what changed? Were defenses built? Systems improved? Or was the data just filed away, labeled confidential and buried in archives? The real shift came not in defense, but in control. Because once you know how invisible threats move, you can use that knowledge. It was no longer just about what an enemy might do. It was about what your own government could do, if it ever had to, or wanted to. A few floors above street level, psychological operations units, PSYOP teams, began studying something deeper. Not the spread of germs, but the spread of ideas. If you could manipulate fear, you didn't need an actual bomb. You only needed people to think there was one. If you could suggest illness without causing it, if you could imply danger without showing it, well, that was power of a higher order. What Operation Sea Spray revealed, more than anything, was how easily the public accepted silence. No outrage in 1950, no headlines, no mass protests, just life continuing, people getting sick, some dying, but no one ever knowing why. And that's how you build something deeper than a database. You build a precedent. In 1977, during a U.S. Senate hearing, the Department of Defense finally admitted that 239 open-air biological tests had been carried out between 1949 and 1969. You remember the number? 239. But that's only what was admitted. Not what was destroyed, not what was renamed, refiled, or left undocumented. As you pass a sculpture by the waterfront, you remember a detail from one of those hearings. We needed realistic data on how biological weapons would behave in American cities. That line haunts you, because it implies that America itself was the test site, that every building, every subway car, every alley and overpass and apartment tower was fair game. You feel the cold edge of that thought settle into your spine, because maybe that's the legacy of sea spray. Not a military victory, not a scientific breakthrough, but a change in how a nation sees its own people, not as citizens, but as subjects, as test cases, as numbers in a file. A seagull lands nearby, pecking at a discarded bag. The city seems quiet again, but the air you breathe holds more than oxygen. It holds memory, ghost data, the trace of 1,000 invisible trials. And you wonder, what's being tested today? You continue walking, your steps quieter now, absorbed by the hush that only comes when the mind has cracked open. Because the next file you read, file 421B, isn't just about bacteria, it's about perception. You turn the page in your mind. Project SHAD, an acronym. Shipboard Hazard and Defense. At first glance, it reads like standard Navy protocol. A cold name, professional, sanitized. But behind those 5 letters is something else. It began in the early 1960s. Officially, it was meant to test the vulnerability of U.S. naval ships to chemical and biological attacks. But the method? That's what pulls at the edges of your comfort. Sailors, thousands of them, on more than 30 vessels were exposed to chemicals, nerve agents, and biological simulants without their consent. They were told it was just routine training, but the clouds that surrounded them weren't mist or fog. They were VX nerve agent, sarin gas, Bacillus globigii, zinc cadmium sulfide, a fine, shimmering powder, glittering in the sun as it rained down on exposed skin and open mouths. Some of the tests were conducted near Hawaii, others near Puerto Rico, or in the open ocean where accountability dissolves like salt in waves. No warnings, no follow-ups, just data collection. You imagine standing on deck, wearing your uniform, smiling at your crewmates. You might not even know that a test had happened, only that some of the guys started coughing, or that your skin itched for weeks, or that, years later, your lungs never quite recovered. Decades passed before any of it came to light. And when it did, the explanation was always the same. We used simulants, not real agents. We didn't expect long-term harm. We were protecting national security, but sailors died. Families sued. And many of the documents remained sealed, not because they were too dangerous, but because they were too embarrassing. You wonder, what is a government more afraid of, espionage or accountability? Then there's Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, a name that sounds like a battlefield in some forgotten war. But this one's modern, clinical, quiet. Between 1955 and 1975, the U.S. Army ran experiments on over 7,000 military personnel. They were exposed to LSD, BZ, a powerful deliriant, mescaline, nerve gases, mustard agents, even exotic chemical cocktails whose composition was never fully disclosed. Sometimes the goal was incapacitation. Other times, it was mind control. Men were told they were testing protective gear or participating in sleep studies. They signed forms that didn't explain what would actually happen. One soldier reported waking up 20 hours later, chained to a gurney, with doctors asking questions he couldn't understand. Another said he forgot who he was for almost 3 days. Some were left with permanent damage. Others, haunted not by memory, but by the gaps where memories should have been. Edgewood wasn't science, it was psychic surgery, performed without anesthetic. But perhaps the most disturbing piece of File 421B is what came next. Because after the human subjects were too controversial, the experiments moved elsewhere, into prisons, into mental hospitals, into unofficial black sites run through shell programs and front companies. At one site in the Midwest, test subjects were told they were participating in a trial for a new antidepressant. In truth, they were being dosed with scopolamine and synthetic hallucinogens, then subjected to interviews designed to map their breakdown. Not their healing, not their recovery, their unraveling, because the question was no longer, what happens if we infect people? It was, what happens if we control them? How long until they crack? Can we predict the shape of collapse? You pause now, standing at the edge of a reflecting pool. Your face stares back at you, warped by ripples, and you realize the government wasn't just studying the body, it was studying the self, your fear, your memory, your obedience. And what if someone could control those? What if they already did? The water flickers. A breeze moves through your jacket. You close your eyes and think, maybe you're not paranoid. Maybe you're just awake. You walk away from the reflecting pool. The image of yourself there, rippled, uncertain, lingers in your mind. You remember what it felt like to first read File 421B, but the next file changes everything. It's not about germs or chemicals anymore. It's about wires. File 517C, labeled Non-Lethal Subdermal Influence, Acoustic and Electromagnetic Conditioning Trials, 1970-1993. That's when you first come across the term. Voice to Skull, V2K. The name sounds like science fiction, like something from a conspiracy board or late-night radio show. But here, in dry government text and grainy diagrams, it's chillingly real. The principle is simple. Microwaves modulated to mimic auditory tones, sent directly into a person's brain. Not heard through the ears, heard inside the skull. The documents describe how researchers discovered the phenomenon while testing radar exposure. Subjects reported hearing clicks, buzzes, and eventually, words. The military called it the Frey effect, named after Alan H. Frey, the scientist who first documented it in the 1960s. By the 1970s, intelligence agencies were attempting to use it, at first to communicate covertly, then to influence. You can almost hear the conversations they must have had in underground labs. What if we could beam commands into someone's thoughts? What if the voice in your head didn't belong to you? Could we convince someone to act, to speak, to obey, without them knowing they were controlled? And if you think that's far-fetched, File 517C includes test data, human trials, conducted on unwitting subjects, inside VA hospitals, inside psychiatric clinics. Patients were admitted with standard diagnoses: depression, PTSD, schizophrenia. Once inside, they were exposed to focused microwave energy, often under the guise of routine imaging. Then the conditioning began. Repeated phrases, simple instructions. You're safe here. Take the pill. Tell them it was your idea. Some patients reported intrusive thoughts. Others became paranoid, unsure whether their minds were their own. A few experienced complete cognitive breaks. But here's the worst part. When they tried to tell someone what was happening, their claims were dismissed as symptoms of their illness. You hear voices? That's just the schizophrenia. Take your medication. Rest. Relax. The perfect cover. You sit down on a bench now. The air is still. And you wonder, if that technology existed decades ago, what exists now? Because File 517C doesn't just reference American research. It also mentions Soviet experiments. Codename, Psychotronics, a Cold War race not for missiles or tanks, but for mind power. The Soviets explored extremely low-frequency, ELF waves, attempting to affect human behavior from great distances. Rumors suggested they had developed mobile units, disguised as radio vans, that could project influence over city blocks. The goal wasn't destruction, it was control. And it makes you pause, because if you could convince someone that every decision they made was their own, even when it wasn't, what need would you have for violence? In 1981, a declassified report from the U.S. Army warned, the potential for psychotronic warfare is greater than that of nuclear or conventional arms. Its effects are silent, long-lasting, and maybe undetectable. You read that line again. Silent, long-lasting, undetectable. You look around the room you're in. The soft whir of electronics, the faint buzz in the walls, the blinking of a Wi-Fi router, and a strange thought surfaces. What if this isn't just history? What if the experiment never ended? What if you're in it now? The next file doesn't have a name, just a number burned into the corner, 844G, and stamped across the front, do not release under any circumstances. You hesitate. Even here, in this imaginary archive, in this dreamlike drift through science and secrecy, you feel a strange pressure not to look further, like the act of reading this file might change something in you. But you open it, and inside are pages soaked in paranoia, not because they're irrational, but because they might be right. This is the file that tries to connect the dots, a quiet theory, assembled from redacted notes, intercepted memos, and post-mortem psychological profiles. It's not a single project, or even a single agency. It's something wider, older, persistent, a pattern of small tests, conducted in public, but never acknowledged, using tools that don't leave bruises, chemicals, frequencies, memes, even dreams. This file proposes that starting in the 1950s, the U.S. government, perhaps in coordination with private labs and defense contractors, began developing what it called sub-threshold influence systems. These weren't designed to brainwash in dramatic Hollywood fashion. Instead, they operated beneath the level of awareness, shaping the edges of mood, nudging behavior slightly off course, tuning mass opinion just enough to shift a conversation. The goal wasn't control. The goal was influence without detection. You flip to one page titled simply, Human Interfaces Battlefield. It outlines an idea that in a truly networked world, the mind becomes the first front line, not through Facebook or Twitter, not through media bias or ad targeting, but through direct interface with the brain's own operating system. You read that again? Direct interface. Another page references the DARPA Silent Talk program, a real military initiative that aimed to read sub-vocalized speech from soldiers' brains, enabling communication without speaking. The tech never reached full deployment, or so they said. But in file 844G, it suggests a quiet success, not as a tool for troops, but as a passive recorder, something that could listen to thoughts without alerting the thinker. A mental wiretap, a technology so gentle it slips past suspicion, and once that's possible, reading the mind, how far is it to writing the mind? You close the folder because it asks questions that can't be comfortably answered. What is free will when your choices are shaped without your knowledge? What is privacy when your thoughts are no longer your own? What is reality when influence is indistinguishable from instinct? You lean back, the room you're in, this safe, quiet mental archive, feels thinner now, less grounded, like it could be reprogrammed at any moment. And as you exhale, you realize this is the moment they wanted you to reach. Not panic, not outrage, but a kind of quiet compliance. Doubt everything, trust no one, and say nothing. The perfect psychological endpoint. But you're not done yet. There are more files, and one of them, the final one, has your name on it. You're not asleep yet. You're still listening, and they know that too. By now, you're wondering if San Francisco was just an anomaly, a rare, strange mistake in the fog. But as you reach for the next file, your fingers brush a folder much thicker than the rest. It groans softly when you lift it, dense with pages. Tucked into the cover is a faded photograph, a woman walking briskly down a New York sidewalk, clutching her handbag. While behind her, two men in suits linger near a parked van. You flip the folder open. It isn't about one test. It's a directory of dozens, one by one. You turn the pages. Minneapolis, 1953. Zinc cadmium sulfide sprayed from rooftop air ducts, hundreds exposed. St. Louis, 1953 to 54. Aerial dispersion of fine particulate matter in low-income neighborhoods. Residents were told it was a smoke test for urban planning. Washington, D.C., 1965. Light bulbs filled with live bacteria were shattered in the city's ventilation tunnels to track the spread of microorganisms. New York City. Multiple dates. Subway stations targeted with bacteria sprayed from light fixtures and maintenance grates. Tracers collected as far as Harlem. Each experiment had a code name. Each involved civilian populations, and none involved consent. You linger over one project. Big City Number 1, Phase B. The notes list 8 million test subjects. The method? Dropping bacteria into the air vents of the New York subway during rush hour. No warning, no cleanup. The bacteria used? Bacillus globigi, later classified as a pathogen. You look up from the file. Something in your chest feels heavy. These weren't isolated experiments. They were part of a long-term strategy, carried out over decades by multiple agencies. You reach a timeline stapled to the back. Each entry tells a quiet horror. 1950, San Francisco, Operation Sea Spray. 1952, Washington, Diptio, biological aerosol release. 1953, Minneapolis, rooftop sprays. 1957, Savannah, Georgia, simulants in air conditioning systems. 1966, New York subway bacteria drop. 1977, news finally breaks. 27 years of silence. You flip to the testimonies collected later. A mother in St. Louis. My child played in the ash that fell from the sky. He thought it was snow. A nurse in Minneapolis. People kept getting nosebleeds. The air felt wrong, but no one listened. A young boy in deep sea, now an old man. I used to run through those tunnels. Thought it was safe. You close the file and stare at the ceiling of your dream archive. So many cities, so many people, so many lines crossed. And it wasn't just the bacteria. It was the belief, the absolute certainty, that the public didn't need to know. That secrecy was not just necessary, but righteous. You press your palm to the cool surface of the file folder and exhale. You're not paranoid. You're paying attention, and that's why you keep going. The next file is thinner, but stranger. It doesn't list experiments. It lists side effects. You lean back, blinking slowly. The ceiling of the archive feels farther away now, as though the air has thickened with everything you've learned. But there's one name that keeps surfacing in the margins. Typed, scribbled, sometimes redacted and replaced with redacted employee. You find the full name eventually, Dr. Leonard J. Cole. Not a test subject, not a military man, a dentist, a gentle-sounding profession. But Dr. Cole had a curious mind and an unusual side project, bioethics and public health policy. And one day in the late 1970s, he stumbled across a footnote in a government document, an offhand remark about a 1950s experiment involving San Francisco and bacteria. He paused. Bacteria? What bacteria? The deeper he looked, the deeper the hole became. He began interviewing survivors, sifting through classified archives, filing Freedom of Information Act requests. He started asking the questions no one wanted to answer. And then he published a book, not a thriller, not fiction, but a cold, carefully documented exposé, Clouds of Secrecy. In it, he described Operation Sea Spray, the subway bacteria releases, the St. Louis particulate sprays. He named names, outlined procedures, and, most damning of all, he showed the public health consequences that had long been brushed aside. There were interviews with families, charts of respiratory illness, comparisons between expected and observed infections, and he made it plain. The military had used American cities as living laboratories. The backlash was swift, not from the public. Most were stunned into silence or disbelief. But from within government circles, it was icy. Suddenly, Dr. Cole found himself under scrutiny. His tax records were audited. his professional affiliations questioned, speaking invitations withdrawn, funding evaporated, not because he had lied, but because he had told the truth too clearly. You flip through a transcript of one of his public lectures. "I'm not here to spread fear," he had said. "I'm here to spread accountability." He wasn't anti-government. He was pro-consent. He simply believed that if the public had been used in experiments, they had a right to know, a right to speak, a right to remember. You linger on his photo. Glasses, calm smile, slight tilt of the head. Not a whistleblower in the Hollywood sense, but a quiet, persistent historian of harm. And through his work, the full story of Operation Sea Spray began to surface, not just in libraries and news reports, but in congressional hearings. Too, for the first time, families of victims were invited to speak. For the first time, a name was put to the strange lung infection that had killed Edward Nevin in San Francisco. And for the first time, the government acknowledged, if only slightly, that maybe, just maybe, they had gone too far. You close Dr. Cole's file slowly. It's the only one in the archive with a faint gold trim, not because of glamour, but because it shines in the dark. You're still in the archive, but it feels deeper now, lower, quieter, as though each file you've opened has slowly led you downward, floor by floor, into the sediment of secrecy. There are no overhead lights in this level, only desk lamps, each with a yellowing shade, casting puddles of light that seem to shrink as you approach. You pick up a memo labeled Subject, Civic Response Protocols, Exposure Disclosure, Sea Spray, SF. Date, September 1977. Status, redacted. It's not fully blacked out, just the key parts, names, locations, dates, and most of the verbs. You tilt it under the lamp, still nothing. Another file, another stamp. Destroy after review, except someone didn't. You open a leather-bound binder labeled DTRA, Cold War Urban Trials. It smells like dust and printer ink, the kind you remember from school libraries. Pages are numbered inconsistently. Some are upside down, some double-stamped with "Not for distribution" in bright red ink that bled through 3 pages. You find a page halfway in. It reads, "Following public inquiry, press response to be minimized through coordinated language strategy. Terms such as simulant, harmless, and routine safety study are preferred. Internal designation: Urban Aerosol Research Initiative, UARI, to replace all mentions of Operation Sea Spray in public-facing materials." You pause. They renamed it. They rebranded a biological attack on civilians as routine safety. But this wasn't an isolated instance. You flip further and find familiar cities: New York, DC, Chicago, each with operation names that sound like code for cleaning products: Big Tom, Dropkick, Dew Point, all neatly cataloged. And in the back, a single handwritten note: "If the public ever finds out, just say it was the Cold War. That excuse still works." There's no signature, no header, just pencil. Faint, but legible. You realize something peculiar. Most of these files don't say classified. They say archived, not locked away, just hidden in volume, in a mountain of misdirection, filing errors, and deliberately boring paperwork. It's not that the government denied it. It's that they buried it alive, a strategy older than any Cold War. If you want to keep something hidden, don't erase it, overwhelm it, drown it in acronyms, binders, and words like routine, and most people will never notice it's there. You leaf through one last folder. Inside is a form titled Internal Use Only, Voluntary Exposure, Simulation Debrief Checklist. At the bottom, in tiny print, "Do not offer this document to civilians unless specifically requested via FOIA and confirmed by Office of Inspector General, OIG." You pause again. The illusion wasn't just that the tests were secret. It's that the truth was never truly hidden, just hard enough to reach that most would never bother. You sit back. The air feels heavier than it did before. Here in this silent archive, truth doesn't scream. It doesn't march. It waits quietly, in folders with no titles and drawers with no labels, hoping one day someone like you might wander far enough, late enough, tired enough to finally open the right file. And you just did. You're no longer in 1950s San Francisco, not even in a dusty Cold War archive. You're here, now, stepping into a sterile modern lab with white walls and smooth glass panels that hum under the glow of LED lights. There's a hiss as the sealed door slides shut behind you. On one table, a sleek silver canister, barely the size of a soda can, emits a blinking green light. It's marked bioweapons dispersal unit. It doesn't look like a weapon. It looks like a smart speaker. You run your hand near the sensor, and a soft voice chirps. Ready for atmospheric deployment. This is not 1950 anymore, and these are not bacteria in buckets. You glance to your left. Wall-mounted screens display simulated city grids, wind patterns, and predicted exposure radius overlays. With a few taps, you could target 10 blocks or 10,000. And the software? It's AI-driven now. It learns, predicts, adjusts in real time. A researcher in a lab coat walks past you, casually scrolling on a tablet. She doesn't even glance at the canister. It's normal here, routine, but your mind drifts back to the ships, the invisible clouds, and that rare infection case on Sarah Street. You remember how easy it was to claim surprise, how silence held for decades. Could it happen again? In some ways, it never really stopped. You skim a report on the table titled Urban Scent Mapping Trials, Behavioral Sway via Olfactory Stimuli. It doesn't sound dangerous, but the footnotes mention aerosolized oxytocin analogs, pheromone mimics, and non-lethal compliance augmentation. Another document is labeled Simulant Use Criteria Update, Post-2020 Revisions. You pause on the phrase, all urban simulants must maintain media deniability if discovered. You glance back at the canister. It could be full of lavender-scented air, or a tailor-made microbe that mimics pollen but binds to serotonin receptors. Either way, if deployed in a crowd, who would notice? Who would question it? Back in the Cold War, it took ships, tanks, secrecy, and silence. Now, one person with a badge and a Bluetooth signal. You step outside the lab. Down below, a city bustles. You watch from the window as people cross intersections, sip iced coffee, laugh with friends under cafe awnings. They're not worried. They shouldn't be. But you wonder, how many trust that nothing invisible ever drifts in with the wind? Because now you know, you don't need bombs to test a city. You only need ambition, a rationale, and a word like safety. And then, no one asks, so could it happen again? You inhale slowly. The air smells clean, but so did the fog that rolled in from the sea all those years ago. You return now, gently, to the edge of the Pacific. San Francisco sleeps below you, its lights soft, scattered like gold dust across the hills. Fog curls over rooftops like a blanket, humming its quiet lullaby. You are no longer in a lab or on a ship. You're simply here, walking slowly along a seaside path where eucalyptus trees whisper in the breeze. The old Presidio looms in silhouette behind you, its military routes long since repurposed into hiking trails and quiet museums. And ahead, the Golden Gate Bridge stretches into the mist, glowing red against a sky faded with stars. You breathe in, and this time, you're not afraid, because history, even the strangest parts, loses its sharp edges in the dark. The bacteria, the sprays, the trials, they become stories. Uncomfortable, yes. Important, certainly. But stories all the same. And stories, when told properly, soften. They tuck themselves under your pillow. They ask you to listen, then let go. In your mind, the ships drift silently out to sea. The canisters close. The wind calms. You walk past a man on a bench, his coat pulled up to his ears. He's asleep, head tilted toward the moonlight. In his lap, a newspaper, today's date printed in bold, 75 years since Operation Sea Spray. You keep walking. The foghorn moans low in the distance, long and low, like a lullaby written by the ocean itself. And finally, you come to rest. You sit on a bench near the water. The chill brushes your cheeks. But it's not unpleasant. The city behind you has forgiven its ghosts for the night. And you? You let your eyes close. Let your thoughts float, soft and formless. Let curiosity fade into calm. Because you've seen the strange files, you've walked the hidden hallways, you've heard the truths they once whispered, and now you can rest. Just you, and the sea, and the slow, steady hum of a city that, tonight, means you no harm. Good night, dreamer. Sleep deeply. You are safe now. The wind is only wind. The mist is only mist. And the story is done.
you.